So today we begin a new sermon series on what is called the Enneagram. We're titling the sermon series, The Sacred Journey. It's this idea, by the Enneagram I'll get into a little bit more detail here in a moment, but the Enneagram is sort of a personality structure and sort of something else alongside of it, but it's all about self-awareness. The sacred journey, we think, is primarily about going within and growing in self-awareness. So Lent is a season Christians celebrate, 40 days leading up to Easter, minus the Sundays. So if you're a mathematician and you're like, that doesn't add up, we don't include the Sundays in that. Sundays are kind of like mini Easter celebrations. And so it's those 40 days leading up to that time. That mirrors the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness, fasting, enduring temptation, and those things. So Christians often use these 40 days as a time to intentionally fast or forego certain things. Sometimes it's social media, sometimes it's Instagram, sometimes it might be TV of any sort, or if you're like me, it's ice cream if you're an ice creamaholic. But you forego things in a way to prepare your heart and open up space. So today we begin on the Enneagram. There's a Christian author, leader named Thomas Kempis, who lived a long time ago, and he wrote a book called The Imitation of Christ. That was one of the most popular, best-known Christian books on devotion. And he once said this, and you can read along on the slide. He once wrote, "A humble self-knowledge is a surer way to God than a search after deep learning." And what I think he means by that is I would rather spend time with somebody who is pretty self-aware than somebody who is not but has a PhD in theology or has all the answers. There's something that happens with self-awareness that automatically creates humility. Jesus talked about this when he looked at other people and said, you see the speck in other people's eyes and you don't notice the log in your own eye. The Enneagram helps us notice the log in our own eye. And as we grow in self-awareness, then we work on our own junk. Then when you bump up against somebody else's junk, you have a little bit more grace, or probably a lot more grace, because you're like, oh, that's teeny compared to this big thing I'm working on here, right? So the Enneagram, next slide. So just so you can see it, in case you're like, I've never heard of that word before, it does sound weird. And if you've never seen the symbol before, like I said last week, you might think pentagram, what church am I in? What is going on here? So, Enneagram, ennea just simply means 9. Gram from the Greek gramma, or points, 9 points. It's this idea that there's 9 different types of people in the world. Now, if you're one of those like me, who's like, wait a minute, there's 7 point whatever billion people today, how can they be dwindled down into 9? That's putting people in a box. I agree, it is. But the Enneagram is far more complex than that. So we start with this idea that there's 9 points. But just to give you a little teaser, you don't need to remember this, but this helps us know that there's many different ways of being human in the world. First of all, if you know your personality type is one of those types, we're going to be learning about type 8 today. Type 8 is, think of it more like a shade or a spectrum of a color. So think of it more like blue. You're somewhere in that blue spectrum. You might be baby blue. You might be bright blue. You might be dark blue. But you still have that undergirding tone about you. You'll share similarities with other type 8s. No 2 type 8s will be exactly the same. So instead of putting people in a box, some of the experts say that the Enneagram helps you understand the box that you tend to put yourself in and give you tools to kind of get out of that box. So after we learn our type, by the way, we sent out on our Facebook online community a test that you can take. If you're a part of our church, if you're newer and you're not in our online Facebook community, it's a private community because we're trying to create a safe place. So search us out, One Church online Facebook community. If you can't find it, search out my name, Aaron Stritzel, befriend me, and I'll send you an invite there. But we sent out tests that you can take. Here's the difficult thing. The Enneagram, unlike other personality tests, structures, tests for your motivation. What is your core motivation? Why do you do the things that you do? which is really hard to test for on a written thing that you fill out. Especially many of them are like, do you do this or that? It's very limiting. So I know a lot of people that took tests that came out as several different types. If you take multiple tests and that's you, that's okay. That's perfectly normal. It took me a long time. I tested as a 2 and then a 3 and then a 4, and finally I found my way down to my type, which I'll share next week. The best type, of course. We all think our type. Actually, so in reality, though, what happens is when you first begin to discover your type, the Enneagram, like I said, is all about self-awareness. So you read a lot of junk. So when you read a type that's probably you and you're like, ooh, that does not sound good, I don't want to be that type, there's a good chance that it's poking and prodding and saying, this is you, this is you. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So if you type for a couple different types, just research them, allow it to birth some curiosity, explore those types. We're all of these types. Every one of us have all 9 types within us. So if you think about it, how I picture it often is I put my finger right in the center and I think we all kind of came into the world that way. But because of suffering or other people, we learned to cope in different ways, and we moved to a certain specific type. So you'll resonate with all of the types. As we're going through all of these, you'll find parts that you resonate with. Just know you tend to dominate towards one type in itself. A few other little things. You have a wing, which also influences that. I know this is a whole new language, isn't it? Once you start getting into the Enneagram and people start asking you all these things, it can get a little weird, but it's fun. So your type has 2 wings on either side. If you're an 8, then you'll have a wing of either a 7 or a 9, and that influences you. So it also makes you a little bit different. Then if you really want to start getting deeper, there's subtypes. There's 3 subtypes: social, one-to-one, and self-preservation. That is all that to say is that it's like an onion. You keep diving in, getting deeper and deeper, and it begins to grow in your self-awareness. You'll also see all these little squiggly lines all over the place. You tend, if you have ever noticed, you tend to act a certain way in some environments and act different ways in other environments. So the Enneagram kind of takes into account that your personality is a little bit fluid. Under stress, you might act a little bit differently. When you're growing and stepping out and moving towards integration or health, you might step out and act a little bit differently. So we'll kind of get into that as we go through each individual, but you'll move towards different numbers, taking on either the positive or the negative aspects of those different numbers. Everybody still with me here this morning? All right. So where did this all, actually, before I address that, nature or nurture? Where do we get our personalities? I have no idea. That's an ongoing question, and it's obviously some of both. And the Enneagram doesn't tell us. It's just there. We develop it over time. The origins of the Enneagram are really unknown. It's been around for a long time. It was probably a process, so it evolved and kind of grew over time. Some people attribute it to a Christian mystic or monk named Evagrius, who formulated the 7 deadly sins, if you're familiar with those. So people added on to that 2 more, and then we get the 7 deadly sins plus an extra 2, 9 total. And people within the first few centuries, especially the desert fathers and mothers, Christian mystics who moved out to the desert, used this personality system as well as others to kind of help people in spiritual formation. So oftentimes, what I think this is, just to be as succinct as possible, which is hard for me if you know me, is that the Enneagram is a tool for spiritual formation. It's a tool. That's all it is. You are not your Enneagram type, but it can help you see how you're motivated and wired, what you look like in health and in unhealth. And again, you'll never resonate if you take a test and you find your type. You will never resonate with 100% of it. It's probably about 70 to 80%. The rest of it, maybe just observe yourself. If it lists things, you tend to do this. Oh, do I? Ask other people. Maybe you do and you don't know it. That was true for me. There was a lot of stuff that I was like, no, that's not me. And then I'm like, and some help from my wife, like, yeah, that's you, honey. So it's all about growth. It's the journey towards growth. So where are we headed in this sermon series for Lent? Today we're going to start with type 8. So for all of you OCD, like, oh my gosh, that just screws it up. 1, duh. Next slide. This is why we're starting with type 8. Not because it's the best number, although some people might argue otherwise. It's a pretty good number. It's next to 9, which is, there's a lot of groups of 3 in the Enneagram. We just went through a sermon series, The Divine Dance, and Angie shared this idea of the number 3 being involved. 3 is literally all over the Enneagram. So on the very basics, you start with this idea of 3 groups of 3. They're called triads. And the first group is the instinctive center, the 8, the 9, and the 1. This group tends to be a more aggressive group, tends to have an underlying a theme of anger. That doesn't mean they're angry all the time. That doesn't mean they're the Hulk and they're going to explode in any second. It's just that's one of their core struggles, is this underlying of anger. They interpret that in very different ways, the 8, the 9, and the 1. It's an instinctive, a body-centered type. Then we move to the 2, 3, 4. That is known as the feeling center. I feel like that's the best name. Like, who doesn't want to be like the heart-centered, feeling-centered? So if that's you, I'm a little jealous. You guys are lucky. The feeling-centered has to do with the heart. These tend to be very personable people, love interacting with others. Most people enjoy them. They also have, because of that, they struggle most with self-image. Thus, this underlying shame can be there because I care and I value what other people think of me so much that underneath, it's not anger so much as shame. Do they like me? Do they not? What do they think of me? So shame is often there. Then the next one, the thinking center, 5, 6, and 7. Just because they're in the thinking center doesn't mean everybody else doesn't think. That's not true. But they tend to live more in their heads than the other types. Because of that, they're always thinking and processing. Fear and anxiety tend to be this undergirding thing. Now, once again, it's not always overt. So it takes some time maybe to learn that. So those in the thinking center tend to think and process through to try to plan ahead. What is the safest, best way to do this thing? And again, each type will do that differently. Some will try to organize and become really, really competent. Others will try to find the safest and securest way. Others may just kind of bypass that and say, I don't want to deal with that next thing. Let's jump and move to the next thing. So there's different ways of dealing with that. You all with me? Lots of information. We're just going through that. There's a lot more online you can do. We are starting up small groups this week. There's sign-up sheets outside. You can purchase this book. It's The Road Back to You for $15, which is what we got it. Actually, it's cheaper than I bought it for on Amazon. You're welcome. I saved you like a quarter. I'm learning to be generous, so that is a bad joke. Okay, pretend I didn't say that. But we're having different small groups going on all over the valley. This will be so interesting to see different people talk about their strengths and weaknesses and discover themselves as well as other people. There's 2 primary goals we hope to accomplish through this whole sermon series. The first one is we hope to create compassion. As we grow in this understanding that I see the world one way and I'm motivated one way, and no wonder people do things that just drive me berserkos and just seem so illogical, and you're just, I don't understand. Well, they're probably coming from a very different place. We're not all the same. Thank goodness. But that does mean we bump into each other sometimes. So learning that we're all different and wired differently hopefully will help us have more compassion for other people. And the second thing, of course, is self-awareness. It's a journey. It's an ongoing journey. So we hope that this will help you with self-awareness and spiritual growth, to give you tools and ideas. Oh, I tend to do this in unhealth, to observe yourself and find ways to kind of move towards greater health. Does that make sense? Awesome. So in a moment, we have a special guest, a friend of mine, Alicia Johnston, who's going to come. She's a female Enneagram type 8. It's been said from those who study the Enneagram that female Enneagram type 8s are one of, or probably the most misunderstood personality types of anyone else. And so we're going to hear from her in just a bit. Before we do, we have a short video that we've prepared that kind of introduces the type 8. So let's go ahead and watch that.
All right, so the Enneagram type 8 is, their quote is, "My way or the highway." So if you know anyone who's kind of like that, they say it's my way or the highway, you're doing it my way or no way at all. They're very insistent on the way that they want things done. That's kind of like the 8 energy. They often will speak with their hands. They'll like hit their hand. They'll clap their hands. They'll like do expressions, big expressions like this. They'll actually own the space that they're in. It's not that they're there and participating in the space of everyone else. They're actually owning this space. Enneagram type 8s often have a commanding presence, and they actually speak with a commanding speaking style. It's like they're the general or the lieutenant in an army, and they're commanding their troops. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to take over. Very much power-oriented. Another saying that I think will resonate with an 8 that I've heard before that I think encapsulates the energy and the spirit of an 8 is, you're either a part of the steamroller or a part of the pavement. To either join me or get out of the way, essentially. And because of this, a lot of the energy of the 8s can be external, and they can be actually, they can come across like they have a hard, tough to get through exterior. And the 8s will often have this because on the inside, beneath that, there's like a more softer, more warm kind of interior. And from what I know of 8s, a lot of times they will have this challenging kind of dueling interaction with people, because what they want to do is they want the people around them to be strengthened. They want people to have enough of their energy and power so that when they're not around, they know that things are going to be okay. And part of the thing with the 8s is the reason why they strengthen others around them is because they themselves have a belief that the world isn't safe for weak people. They have only the strong survive could be kind of like a maxim that they hold to. And because of this, they will actually be the most prone towards conflict. So if you're like an anti-conflict person, chances are maybe an 8 rubs you the wrong way. Maybe they're too abrasive for you. But if you're a person who likes conflicts, maybe you like the fact that they duel with you. And that's a term that I would use for is they duel. It's like me versus you, and the conflict comes in there, and they want to test you to see what your mettle is, basically. So some famous 8s would be like Martin Luther King Jr. or Clint Eastwood. These people manifest the 8 energy in a very positive way and are loved by a lot of people, but some who manifest it in a more negative way would be like Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein also has the 8 energy, but manifested it in for evil, I guess you could say, rather than good. So a great song that maybe could be for a type 8 is Frank Sinatra, "I Did It My Way." The storm drums of Hans Zimmer is an example of what I would say captures the 8 energy, just like stuff like that.
Listen up. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think a little caveat. I think he's very much describing like a male 8 in that, because female 8s are like socialized to not be that way their entire lives. So often we don't necessarily turn out that way. But he was actually being really nice when he used Saddam Hussein, because Hitler was probably an 8. So, yeah. So is the current president, most likely, is an 8. But so is Harry Potter, and he's cool, right? So, I kind of feel like 8s tend to be like the best and the worst in society. Like, it's just kind of an extreme thing. Like an 8 who's healthy can do these amazing, wonderful things, and usually gets killed in the process, right? But an 8 who is unhealthy can do like the worst, most tragic things in society. So it's kind of like a, if you have an 8, like if you're an 8 personality, like you got to be careful. Is this for me? Okay, awesome, thank you. So you got to be careful. So let's go ahead and start with the slides. I'm probably not going to we'll skip through the next 2 because Aaron already covered that stuff. Perfect. So I want to talk about like a healthy 8. Let's kind of dive right in. Like a healthy 8 is like inspirational, magnanimous, sacrificial, self-restrained, confident, a strong leader. Be the kind of person who makes you feel like this is like a kind of person who can make a space that's safe, or can protect people, can make people kind of feel at ease. Like, okay, like this is someone who we can trust. This is someone who has our best interests in mind. This is someone who kind of has the strength to do what needs to be done to protect us, to help us to get it through in a time of crisis. And people often rely on 8s to be strong when they need someone to be strong. And like many personality traits, on the Enneagram, you have to be careful because those things that people will turn to you for those characteristics of maybe strength and power as an 8. Well, then when that comes out in a way that people don't like it, they're going to like turn on you, right? So we just have this tendency for all personalities to take advantage of people for their core characteristics, but then when it like comes out in a way that we don't like, then we're like, yeah. So be patient with your 8s. Because remember, if you need them, they're going to be there for you, and they're going to show up in a really major way at a time where you need someone to be there. I think a healthy 8 embodies the positive side of anger. It's like Jesus turning over the tables in the temple. That's like that kind of positive 8, that can be there. I don't know if any of you watched, there's a teenage girl who was there during the shooting in Florida who gave a speech. If any of you guys saw that, like that's a healthy 8. Like I'm sure that response was a healthy type of an 8 response. Like she's angry, and that's giving her what she needs to say what needs to be said, when other types on the Enneagram are going to have a really hard time doing that. But that anger can sometimes give us the ability to do things that should never be done. So speaking of which, like an unhealthy 8, for the next slide, an unhealthy 8 is going to be like combative, unpredictable, maybe like paranoid. An unhealthy 8, instead of kind of bringing people in to their sphere of protection, then that sphere is going to get so small that it's only them and they're the only ones they're trying to protect. That's kind of the vibe of an unhealthy 8. So delusions of grandeur, obsessions with power. Some of you might be thinking about somebody. A lot of us are probably thinking about the same person right now. So that's like the bad side of an 8, and it's really bad. It's really dark. So, don't be too hard on 8s. You might create a monster. So, yeah. So let's dive into talking about the actual characteristics of being an 8 and what it means. So move to the next slide. Can you guys read that? So when you're an 8 as a woman, like that whole bossy, like you get called bossy constantly. So do probably like 1s who are women probably get called bossy too. Like any woman who's strong, it must be a bad thing. So bossy, intimidating, like men definitely would just, because they're just not used to a woman kind of having that type of an energy. And there's segments of society, I know a lot of us here grew up in kind of like traditional male-female type of teaching. And within that paradigm, like female 8s aren't actually supposed to exist. Like really, we're not supposed to be something God created. So, that's awesome. Yeah, so, kind of where I grew up, there's a little bit more room for being an 8 than maybe some environments, but still, like, if a woman is a leader, a woman is supposed to be a leader in a certain way, you know? So it's supposed to be a leader in kind of a soft way. It's kind of not supposed to be it's probably supposed to, like, let the held out or actually make the decisions, but, you know. So that's kind of the way, because I was a pastor before. So that's kind of the way that you're socialized to be as an 8. I can tell you, like, when I used to date men, it doesn't it doesn't work very well. Like, I'm sure, like, a different segment of society that's a little less patriarchal, but the whole patriarchy thing, I think, like women who are 8s who end up in good relationship with men, I think usually, like, both people maybe embrace that, you know, the traditional gender roles don't have to happen in this relationship. Or maybe they're both 8s, and that's got to be a roller coaster ride. I can't even imagine. It's got to be crazy. So those would be the only 2 scenarios. But fortunately, I'm queer, so my girlfriend is totally down with me being an 8. So that works out really well for me. Thank you, Jesus. So next slide. An 8, kind of, if you think of the basic desire of an 8. Okay, so here's the most important thing for understanding an 8. The absolute most important thing, and this goes against a bit that video, and that's that the basic desire of an 8, the basic fear of an 8 is being controlled. Like, 8s are afraid of being controlled by other people. They're afraid of being so weak. We're afraid of being so weak that other people can control us, that we lose autonomy over ourselves. Now, if you combine that with paranoia and an unhealthy 8, that means I have to control everybody. But that is not the base fear. That is not the basic drive. The basic drive is not to control other people. The basic drive is to not be controlled yourself. So for me, as I have kind of grown as in various leadership positions, I've seen how well it does not work being an 8 who maybe controls other people or just, like, makes a really quick decision and everybody else isn't totally on board. As I've seen how much that doesn't work, I've grown more and more to embrace the idea that I want to make sure that everybody else is not being controlled either, right? So 8s, natural leaders, have been a leader since I was a kid, just naturally telling other kids in the playground what to do. You know, so I bumped into a lot of problems, you know, within that, and learned, like, basically to value that I don't want to be controlled, and so I don't want other people to be controlled either. And that's really helped me to transform my leadership style, my personal style, to really kind of cause less problems. And I also think that this is the flip side of being an 8 as a woman. There's, like, a downside. Like, when I realized what had been happening my whole life, like, as a woman who's an 8, it was kind of depressing. I just felt like, whoa, like, I haven't been allowed to be who I am. And how much of this stuff have I bought into, and how much have I tried to cover up something that's just, like, an awesome fundamental part of who I am. A lot of 8s find out about it and are, like, really excited to be 8s. Like, power! So I kind of felt like man, like, that's been, like, covered up so much. But I've come to realize, and I haven't heard anyone else say this, but I've come to realize that there's actually also a huge advantage of being an 8 as a woman, and that's that you have to learn to include more people, because if you don't, people are going to reject you. And so you have to learn to kind of communicate things in a way that values others. You have to learn to literally actually value others. Like, wow. So you have to learn to do those things as a way of making it in the world and as a way of being effective. So in a way, it's really challenging, and it's kind of like a constant kind of burden and challenge. But in another way, there is that advantage that you do learn some of the skills that I feel like sometimes for a male 8 who just can, especially a male 8 who might be wealthier real estate mogul, like they can just come into a room and just like throw their weight around and tell everybody what needs to be done and just spout off whatever they want to say, and they can get away with it a lot more easily. And they never have to learn those lessons that are really, really good to learn. So there's kind of that desire of protecting yourself, which I've kind of gone back and forth on that terminology and whether I actually like it. But I think I do, because a lot of not wanting to be controlled is kind of related to that wanting to be able to protect myself. So just another quick word about when that becomes unhealthy. So you saw the actual shape of the Enneagram, and Aaron spoke for a moment about integration and disintegration. So kind of the way I think about it when it goes to disintegration into a 5, it's kind of that unhealthy side of the 5. So it's that like kind of nervous, like paranoia, like afraid that people aren't going to be cool with you, kind of a 5, and maybe indecisive and not sure what to do and overanalyzing things. And that's the point at which you become really self-protective in a negative way, and you just like, forget everybody who's going to try to control me. So, and then in the positive way is when you kind of don't feel that paranoia, kind of have more of that confidence, and you get more open to other people and more caring of other people and more generous. I really think of it as in, that kind of sphere of who is important to you expands, and in a really positive way. So that's kind of the healthy path. So let's go to the next slide. So that's okay here, right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one to talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So all the Enneagrams have a sin, right? Like a basic kind of a sin. And I kind of love the Enneagram because from my conservative background, it's like, oh, we can still talk about sin and be progressive. And that's the Enneagram way of talking about sin, which is like, I know nobody's like, oh, talk about sin, yay. But the Enneagram way of talking about sin is like, it's more related to like kind of your basic drives and kind of your unhealthy ways of functioning that you can learn about and change in a really kind of deep level kind of a way. I'm really conscious of my hand motions now that we watched that intro video. Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, I'm not like that. God, you guys caught me on a funny day. All right, so lust. I've never stood before a group of people in church and said, like, I have a lust problem. But all 8s have like a lust problem on some level, right? And think of lust kind of in broad terms, including sexual, but also including just passion and intensity. And sometimes, that can manifest itself in super negative ways. You get so passionate, so intense about something, and it's almost a way of like bringing you out of yourself, but not in a good way. It's like disconnecting yourself from your body and your physical existence and from health and maybe even from reality itself, because you're so intently focused on something, so passionate about something that's driving you, and that does include a lot of anger as well within that passion, but it's not just like anger. We're not just angry, like we're passionate about something that's really important. And that can really lead to some serious neglect of your own physical and mental well-being, to the point that I have burned myself out so many times in life, burned myself out I can't function right now anymore, kind of I just can't. I remember sitting in a class after just going way too intensive for a semester and sitting in the class being like, wow, I think this is good stuff, but I literally incapable of paying. I just couldn't. It was just like a marshmallow. I had to just sit for 6 weeks before I could recover. So that's kind of something that we struggle with on the negative side, and on the positive side. And for me, I'm finally coming to realize that, like, one of the ways I've kind of coped with being an 8 who's a woman is, like, trying to, like, use that intensity to, like, impress people. Like, assume that people just kind of try to play it back a little bit and assume that people are going to think, you know, whatever they're going to think. And then my opportunity is going to come and bam! Like, oh, damn it. Oh, he was right. But yeah, like, that's exactly. Oh my gosh. So I'm finally learning. Just cussed from the pulpit. It's been a fear of mine for a long time. It's okay now, though. It's okay. So, you guys are great. I like you guys. Yeah, so I've just kind of realized, like, just be yourself. Stop trying to impress people. Just let yourself be who you are. Kind of enjoy the person that God made you to be. Just chill out. Chill is something my personality type is not good at all. Chill is not good. Yeah, and another, you know, when we get in that thing, it's also really tough to see that the world isn't black and white. You know, it's really, because that's, you know, you get passionate about something, you throw yourself all into something, and it's like, if you're not on this path, like, you're on the wrong path. You're just like, you've got to. I was talking to a fellow friend, Kev Garcia, if you guys know him. He's also an 8, and we were talking because I did this talk, and he just loved it. And I was like, yeah, it's because we're both 8s. And he's like, I just want everybody to just, like, do the right thing. I was like, yeah, like, all the time with great passion, just all the time. That's what it's like to be an 8. It can be so frustrating because, like, you just kind of, you want other people to just kind of see it and grab it and run with it. And, you know, because we're all about, like, not being weak and not being vulnerable, it can be really tough as a leader to deal with the fact that other people don't experience life that way. And for other people, it can be really hard. And, like, for me, if I think it's for a good cause, I have no problem making people feel uncomfortable, like, none whatsoever. And I was kind of relating to a friend an experience in which I made someone feel uncomfortable, and I felt really proud of myself. And she was like, you know, for other types in the Enneagram, that would be real. She was like, if I did that, she was a 2. She's like, if I did that, I would be worrying about it for days. So, I mean, it's just, you know, but then we've got to be very, very careful, because without having that, it's very easy for us to run people over. It's very easy for us to hurt people, but we do not intend to do that at all, most of us. So it's just very easy to do. It's just gonna happen sometimes. So learning to apologize is a good quality for an 8. So let's go on to the next. So there's also these virtues that are healing for each personality on the Enneagram. And the thing about the virtues is these are not things that come naturally and easily to you. So my spiritual director, you know, I wasn't entirely sure if I was an 8 at this point, and she kind of asked me, like, what do you think about the idea of innocence? I was like, honestly, I think it's kind of weak and stupid. Like, that's just like my gut level reaction to the idea of innocence. And she's like, well, good, that might mean you're an 8. Innocence feels, ugh. But innocence is exactly what we need. Like, innocence is exactly what can heal us. So I've been meditating on innocence, and I have, like, a homework assignment to do things that, like, embody innocence. So I've been thinking a lot about, like, what is, like, an innocent thing to do? What is innocence? It's really been helpful for me. If any of you have read, big old nerd, if any of you have read The Brothers Karamazov? Yeah, it's okay, own it. Yeah. There's a character in that book who, to me, embodies innocence, because no matter what happens around him, terrible things happen around him. Murder happens around him. Just abusive behavior, just violence, anger, arrogance. All these things are happening around him, and yet he never really loses his innocence. Like, he goes through life in this way where he's not oblivious to the dark side of what's happening, but he's got this fundamental optimism, this fundamental outlook that no matter what bad happens around him, he still sees goodness and beauty. And that's like the really hard thing for people like me to see, and also the really healing thing. Because what really turns me unhealthy is cynicism. And that's what I have to stay away from, because that's when 8s become dangerous, is when they get cynical. And they just think it has to be my way or the highway, because otherwise nothing's going to be okay. And so meditating on innocence is like really kind of my salvation, the thing that's really hard for me, though. And so then a lot of people who are into the Enneagram will talk about, well, think back to kind of your childhood when your personality was forming. And so one of the things I think about is, like, what is that innocence in myself when I was a child that I felt was going to be my weakness, that I had to cover up? You know, what is that innocence in myself that kind of at an early age I decided was going to bring me rejection instead of bringing me what I actually want? So that desire that I turned away from and said, I'm going to be stronger than that. What is that, and how can I get back to that? Like, that's where the healing can be, and where the healing space is for the 8. Also, they say, like, 8s, when you get angry, should, like, hold a child. You know, because kids are just so innocent. Like, so innocent. Like, they haven't done anything yet that I can judge them for. So, like, they're really good. So if you can connect with that kind of innocence of a child, it can help to kind of soothe you and help you to reconnect with that basic value and how life is really worth living and what goodness there is in life. So moving on to the last slide, almost done. So the healing emotion is vulnerability. So reading lots and lots of Brené Brown is a thing that 8s have to do. Yeah, she's great. So that feeling of vulnerability, like, there's very few people in my life who know this, but with those people who I feel really safe with, I'm actually, like, really a crier. Like, I cry easily with people who I really am close to, because, like he said, like, underneath there is that kind of softness, and that ability to be vulnerable is like healing in itself for me. But it's really hard to accomplish. Like, you'll probably notice in a lot of this, I talk about how to be a healthy 8, and probably a lot of that is me, like, avoiding vulnerability. You know, and talking, it's hard to do that. You know, it's easy for me to be vulnerable about things in a controlled way. It's easy to me to be vulnerable in a place where I know people's gonna love it if I'm vulnerable. And vulnerable about things I've overcome in the past, but really true, raw, like, I'm struggling right now and I need help. That is, like, I don't need help. You kidding me? Like, I've got it handled. That is what's incredibly hard for an 8. And that is what is absolutely incredibly hard for me, to even recognize for myself that I need help, let alone ask somebody for help. I'm having trouble remember doing that, like, ever. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. And one of the things that I've thought about a lot, because one of the things my girlfriend says to me is a lot is, like, you gotta learn to surrender, like, learn to surrender. And because she's my girlfriend, I listen to her. And so I've thought a lot about the idea of surrender. And I think it's a spiritual concept. You know, I've been really, like, traumatized by my experiences with faith and with Christianity. And so it's kind of a slow process of, like, reclaiming the parts that I can, and maybe in ways that are different. And the concept of surrender has been a really important one for me, to realize, like, surrender doesn't mean what it's so often phrased to mean, like surrendering yourself and your autonomy to the church and to what God says you should do. being what we're telling you God says you should do, and like the doctrine and the behaviors, like that is what I felt like. I surrendered everything to all that, and it was like the worst thing I ever could have done. So what are you talking to me about surrender? I don't need to surrender. The best thing I did was when I stopped surrendering. But then I realized, I think there's a different kind of surrender. It's a surrender that isn't to any kind of institution, isn't kind of any teaching. It isn't to any kind of like, this is the right way and the right thing to do. Because that actually just kind of feeds my 8 energy in a negative way. It's actually just a surrender to be open. Just to be open to the world, to the presence of God in the world, to the fact that things can surprise you and turn out differently than you think that they could be. Just to not have it all figured out and to be living life with more of an open hand. And so that idea of surrender is what has been helping me to kind of heal and to say, this can help me to be a better person. This can help me to overcome some of those fears and some of those pains and some of those suffering. Is learning to surrender. And probably each of you will find, whether you're an 8 or whether you're another personality type, that it is those very ideas that you're like, what are you talking about? I don't need, that's the last thing I need. That if you pay attention to that reaction and instead say, well, maybe I just need to contemplate on that a bit and try to understand that a little bit better, that could turn out to be the exact thing that you do need. This is the thing that you've been kind of pushing away because it threatens your way of survival in the world.